the US government experiment that let black men die. Tuskegee Experiment. In 1932, the United States government began a medical study. It did not involve prisoners. It did not involve enemy soldiers. It did not involve volunteers who understood the risks. It involved American citizens. For 40 years, doctors watched men grow sick. They documented pain. They recorded suffering. They planned autopsies. And when a cure existed, they made sure it was never given. This was not a rumor. It was not a conspiracy theory. It was not exposed decades later by historians. It was confirmed by the United States government itself. The study was called the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Most Americans have heard the name. Few know what actually happened. The men in this study were told they were receiving treatment. They were told the government was helping them. They trusted the doctors. They trusted the nurses. They trusted the system. That trust was used against them. This documentary is not about modern politics. It is not about assigning guilt to the present. It is about decisions that were made by institutions, by professionals, by people who believed they were acting in the name of science. To understand how this could happen, we must begin before the experiment itself. We must begin with the America that allowed it. The story of the Tuskegee Experiment does not begin with doctors or laboratories. It begins with the social reality of the United States in the early 20th century. In 1932, America was in crisis. The Great Depression had devastated the economy. Banks failed. Farms collapsed. Jobs vanished. But for black Americans in the South, economic collapse was not new. It was inherited. In states like Alabama, segregation was enforced by law and violence. Jim Crow governed every aspect of daily life: where people could live, where they could work, and whether they could receive medical care at all. Most black families in rural Alabama survived through sharecropping. They farmed land they did not own, borrowed supplies they could not afford, and remained permanently in debt to white landowners. Healthcare was a luxury few could imagine. Hospitals routinely refused black patients. Doctors rarely visited black communities. When they did, it was often for charity work or experimentation. Disease was everywhere. One of the most feared illnesses of the time was syphilis. Untreated, it progressed slowly over decades. It attacked the nervous system, the heart, and the brain. It caused blindness, paralysis, dementia, and death. In many communities, syphilis was not even spoken about directly. People used vague terms: bad blood, weakness, the sickness. Medical knowledge was limited. Trust in institutions was fragile. Yet in Macon County, Alabama, there was one institution that symbolized hope: Tuskegee Institute. Founded as a center of black education and self-reliance, the institute carried authority. Its presence gave legitimacy to programs associated with it, even government programs. When federal officials arrived claiming to offer free medical care, people listened. The United States government, through the U.S. Public Health Service, presented itself as a benevolent force. Free checkups, free meals, burial insurance. In a place where death often meant financial ruin for families, burial insurance alone was enough to convince many men to participate. These men were not reckless. They were not ignorant. They were responding rationally to an environment of scarcity. And that environment was carefully exploited. The Tuskegee Experiment was not created in isolation. It was born from a system that already treated black lives as expendable. The Tuskegee Experiment did not begin as an accident. It began as a proposal. In the early 1930s, public health officials were deeply interested in syphilis. At the time, there was no reliable cure. Treatment options were painful, dangerous, and often ineffective. Some researchers believed that studying untreated syphilis would provide invaluable data. They wanted to document the disease from beginning to end. Not in animals, but in human beings. The decision was made to study black men. This choice was not incidental. Medical literature of the era was filled with racial assumptions. Black bodies were described as biologically different. Some doctors claimed syphilis affected black men differently, or less severely. These ideas were not fringe beliefs. They were taught in medical schools. They were published in respected journals. The study was approved. Funding was secured. Local cooperation was arranged. No serious ethical objections were recorded. The experiment was designed to last 6 months, but embedded within the planning documents was a more disturbing reality. The men were never meant to be cured. They were meant to be observed until death. The study included regular examinations, blood tests, painful spinal taps, scheduled follow-ups for decades. Autopsies were considered essential to the data. At no point was informed consent discussed in any meaningful way. The researchers did not believe consent was necessary. In their view, the subjects were not patients. They were data points. And once the machinery of the study was in motion, it became self-justifying. Each year of data made the next year seem necessary. Each death reinforced the importance of completing the research. By the time doubts arose within the medical community, the experiment had developed its own momentum. Stopping it would have meant admitting it was wrong. So it continued. The success of the Tuskegee experiment depended on one thing above all else: trust. The men selected for the study were not chosen at random. They were chosen because of their vulnerability. Most were poor. Many were illiterate. Nearly all had limited access to formal medical care. Government officials understood this. Recruitment was conducted carefully, deliberately, and locally. Doctors did not arrive alone. They were accompanied by nurses and intermediaries known in the community, people the men already trusted. The men were told they were being treated for a condition called bad blood. The phrase was intentionally vague. It carried no specific diagnosis. It allowed doctors to avoid explaining syphilis while still sounding familiar. To the men, bad blood explained fatigue, pain, and weakness, symptoms many already experienced from hard labor and poor nutrition. Nothing about the explanation was accidental. The incentives were powerful. Free medical examinations, free meals on clinic days, and perhaps most important, burial insurance. In rural Alabama, burial costs could devastate a family. The promise that funeral expenses would be covered gave men a sense of dignity and security. What they did not know was that the examinations were not treatments. Spinal taps were described as special procedures. Pain was reframed as healing. Follow-up visits were framed as progress. The men believed they were receiving care. They returned year after year. At no point were they informed that the goal of the study was to let the disease run its course. There was no consent form, no explanation of risks, no opportunity to refuse once enrolled. This was not a failure of communication. It was deception by design. The doctors believed the men would not understand the truth. Some believed they did not need to. And because the men trusted the authority of the government, the lie held. As the years passed, the Tuskegee experiment settled into routine. Appointments were scheduled. Symptoms were recorded. Charts were updated. The men aged. Syphilis progressed slowly, methodically. Early symptoms faded, giving a false sense of stability. Then, years later, the damage emerged. Blindness, loss of coordination, mental confusion, heart failure. Doctors documented everything. Each decline was recorded as data. Each death was seen as a completed observation. Autopsies were critical to the study. In some cases, arrangements were made years in advance. The men were not told this. They were not treated as patients whose suffering demanded intervention. They were treated as subjects whose suffering justified the research. Inside the medical system, the study became normalized. Young doctors inherited the project from older ones. New administrators reviewed the files and allowed it to continue. Stopping the experiment would have meant questioning decades of work. And so the men continued to die. Quietly, slowly, largely unnoticed by the nation. In the early 1940s, medical history changed. Penicillin was discovered. For the first time, syphilis could be cured safely, quickly, and effectively. Within a few years, it became the standard treatment across the United States. Doctors working on the Tuskegee experiment knew this. They discussed it internally. They acknowledged its effectiveness. They understood what it meant. And they made a decision. The men would not receive it. This was no longer passive observation. This was active denial of care. When some participants attempted to enlist in the military during World War II, they were diagnosed and scheduled for treatment. Intervention followed. Researchers moved quickly to block it. The men were pulled from treatment lists. Their military exams were flagged. Local clinics were discouraged from intervening. The experiment took priority over human life. By this point, the study had continued for more than a decade. Ending, it would have exposed its moral failure. So the cure was withheld. And the experiment continued. By the 1950s, the Tuskegee Experiment had been running for nearly 20 years. For the men enrolled in the study, time did not bring relief. It brought accumulation. The damage caused by untreated syphilis rarely appeared all at once. It arrived gradually, often invisibly, until it could no longer be ignored. But the harm did not stop with the men. Syphilis is a communicable disease. It spreads through intimate contact. It passes silently from one body to another. Wives were never warned. No one explained the risk. No one suggested testing. No one offered protection. Many women became ill without understanding why. Some experienced miscarriages. Others gave birth to children with congenital syphilis, a condition that caused deformities, blindness, neurological damage, and early death. These children were not part of the study. They were never recorded as subjects. Their suffering did not appear in official charts. Yet their lives were shaped by the same deception. Families struggled to care for men whose bodies and minds were failing. Some men became unable to work. Others became confused, paranoid, or aggressive as neurological symptoms worsened. The burden fell on wives and children, often without explanation, often without support. The government knew this was happening. Medical staff observed family transmission. Internal reports acknowledged congenital cases. Still, the experiment continued. The justification was always the same. Ending the study would compromise the data. Human cost was treated as collateral. For decades, entire households lived inside a tragedy they could not name. By the late 1960s, medical ethics in the United States had begun to change. The world had seen the consequences of unethical research during World War II. International standards were evolving. Questions were being asked. Inside the Tuskegee Experiment, however, little had changed. That silence was broken by one man. His name was Peter Buxton. Buxton was a public health worker who learned of the study while reviewing records. What he read disturbed him deeply. He raised concerns internally. He questioned the ethics. He asked why the men were still untreated. His concerns were dismissed. Again and again, he was told the study was too important to stop. Eventually, Buxton made a decision. He went to the press. In 1972, the story broke. Newspapers across the country reported that the US government had deliberately allowed black men with syphilis to go untreated, even after a cure existed. The reaction was immediate. Public outrage spread rapidly. Civil rights organizations demanded answers. Congress launched investigations. Within months, the study was finally shut down. After 40 years, the experiment was over. But the damage was already done. By the time the public learned the truth, dozens of men had died. Many wives had been infected. Children had been born with lifelong disabilities. The nation was forced to confront a reality it had ignored. This was not ancient history. This was modern America. When the Tuskegee Experiment was finally shut down in 1972, the United States government did not immediately apologize. Instead, it entered a long period of legal review, internal reform, and quiet settlement. Survivors of the study filed a class action lawsuit against the federal government. In 1974, the case was settled. Financial compensation was provided. Lifetime medical benefits were promised to survivors, their wives, and affected children. But money could not restore health. It could not return the dead. And it could not erase 40 years of betrayal. For many of the men who survived, the settlement arrived late in life. Some were already blind. Some were disabled. Some were no longer fully aware of what had been done to them. What they did understand was simple. They had trusted the government, and that trust had been violated. In the years following the exposure, the United States began to confront the broader implications of the experiment. The Tuskegee study became a case taught in medical schools, not as a scientific success, but as a warning. New ethical frameworks were created. Informed consent became a legal requirement. Independent review boards were established to oversee research involving human subjects. Doctors were required to explain risks, benefits, and alternatives in clear language. These changes reshaped American medicine. But they were reactive. They existed because harm had already occurred. For decades, survivors waited for something else, an acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. That acknowledgement came in 1997. In a ceremony at the White House, President Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the United States government. Survivors of the study were invited to attend. Some arrived in wheelchairs. Others were accompanied by family members who had lived with the consequences of the experiment their entire lives. Clinton spoke plainly. He acknowledged that the government had deceived its own citizens, that it had withheld treatment, that it had allowed suffering in the name of science. He said, "What was done cannot be undone." For many watching, the apology was necessary. But it was not closure, because apologies do not erase history. They do not restore trust. The Tuskegee Experiment left behind something far more enduring than policy reforms. It left mistrust. Surveys conducted decades later showed that Black Americans were significantly less likely to trust medical institutions, less likely to participate in clinical research, more likely to question medical advice. This mistrust did not emerge from rumor or misunderstanding. It emerged from experience. The Tuskegee study became shorthand for a larger truth, that institutions could cause harm while claiming to help, that professionals could justify cruelty through bureaucracy, that suffering could be normalized if it was recorded carefully enough. Today, the Tuskegee Experiment is often referenced in discussions about public health, ethics, and consent. It is invoked during debates about medical research, during conversations about healthcare disparities, during moments when trust between institutions and communities is strained, not because it is convenient, but because it happened, and because forgetting it would be easier than learning from it. The men in the Tuskegee Experiment were not heroes. They were not activists. They were not trying to make history. They were farmers, laborious, husbands, fathers. They believed the government when it said it was there to help. They showed up for appointments. They followed instructions. They trusted authority. That trust became the foundation of their suffering. The Tuskegee Experiment did not require cruelty from every individual involved. It required something quieter: compliance, silence, routine. It required people to accept that harm was unfortunate, but necessary. And that is why this story matters. Not because it is shocking, but because it is ordinary. It unfolded slowly. It passed through committees. It survived administrative reviews. It lasted 40 years, not because no one knew, but because stopping it would have required saying it should never have begun. History often asks us to believe that progress is inevitable. Tuskegee reminds us that progress is a choice, and that when those choices fail, the consequences can last for generations. This happened in the United States. It was funded by the government. It was defended by professionals. And it was allowed to continue, long after it should have ended. Remembering this story is not about blame. It is about responsibility, because the systems that failed then only change when people refuse to forget.